Alright, so this is the first lecture that we're trying out here for Chapter 9, Section 1 for Sociology. The topic for this lecture is going to be systems of stratification. Now, just a couple of key ideas that we need to touch on to make sure we understand everything else going along with this section. First of all, the concept of social stratification. The basis of social stratification is that people are ranked based on, as the definition says, their unequal access to scarce resources. What that means is that people are given certain status in society based on their wealth, their power, and how they are able to access certain resources, material goods, homes, higher levels of education, high-paying jobs, low-paying jobs. It is a ranking of people based on their access to those types of resources. Now, the second term we need to look at is social inequality. The basis of social inequality is that there is an unequal sharing of social rewards and resources. This unequal sharing is going to be seen in many ways. For instance, in our society, we see a lot of people who are not given access to the same levels of education. All right, you compare what we have here at Burlington High School compared to what they have at certain more poverty-stricken neighborhood schools in bigger cities, and you will find very quickly that we have a much greater access to certain resources, whether it be technology like the video you're watching here, the PowerPoint overhead presentations that we have access to, whether it could also be perhaps a wider range of classes because we have a larger faculty possibly than some schools have. When you compare us to certain well-to-do schools, we also struggle behind in that regard. We might have less technology than some schools, offer less electives, things like this because of a lack of financial resources that we might have. The rankings for social inequality and social stratification, basically they can be assigned based on either ascribed or achieved status. Again, to remember or to remind you what ascribed and achieved status, what those concepts are. Ascribed status is going to be basically the idea that you do not earn your place in life. Everything you have, you've been given. You have been placed into or born into a family of certain wealth. You stay in that family of certain wealth, that concept. Achieved is that you've earned it. It is something that we have worked for, something that we have tried to do to improve our standing in life. Now, a couple types of social stratification. First of all, we have a caste system. The caste system is what you've probably heard discussed when we've talked about, or when people have talked about India in your history classes, something like that. Caste system, you are assigned what caste you're in at birth. Whatever family you're born into, that is your caste. That is where you have been born into. If you're born into a poorer caste, you are stuck there for the rest of your life. In a caste system, there is very rarely any chance at moving up or down in society. Instead, what you typically see is that you are in this position for the rest of your life, and the only way out of it is in many societies at least, through religious means. If you look, one of the predominant areas where they have the caste system, India, that I mentioned earlier, they have a large population there that is Hindu. And part of the belief system of the Hindu population revolves around this idea of reincarnation. And so the basic of this is that if you are Hindu and you are born into a low caste, you will continue to be in that low caste for the rest of your life. And if you want to get into a higher caste, basically what you have to do at that point is live your life in this low caste as well as you can. Follow the rules, do what is necessary, and at that point, when you pass away and are reincarnated, you might come back into a higher caste. That is really your only relief, your only way out in some of these societies. As I mentioned earlier, the position in the caste system is ascribed. That means you don't earn it. You are just born with it. You are stuck with it. There's nothing you can do. And ascribed status is going to be, the family lines concept. Being a brother, being a dad, being a mother, those things are ascribed status. They're not necessarily earned. And then within a caste system, you also typically see the concept of endogamy being common. Endogamy is the idea that you marry within your own caste, within your own class. So if you're poor, you marry a poor person. If you are rich, you marry a rich person, and so on. The other type of stratification system is called a class system or an open class system. A class system can change throughout your lifetime. You are usually born into a class, or you are always born into a class, and we're going to look at America as the prime example of a class system. You are born into a class. Whatever class your parents are, that is your class, most likely for the remainder of your childhood. But that class can change, depending on achievements or failures of your family members, of yourself. Your class can change throughout your lifetime. Because it is depending on the achievements or the failures of you or your family, you would say that class systems are achieved, or class ranks are achieved. You have to earn those. Now, the concept here of exogamy, which is the opposite of endogamy, exogamy is allowed in an open class system. What that means is that you are allowed to marry, if you're poor, to marry a rich person. If you are rich, you can marry a middle class person. There is not necessarily, there are not going to be laws preventing such a thing, but endogamy is still the most common practice. The poor typically marry into poor families, the rich typically marry into rich families, the middle class marry into middle class families. And the reason for this is more of association. If you are poor, you probably live in a poorer neighborhood, attend a school that is lesser funded, attend a college, if you go to college, that is more of a run-of-the-mill college, and have a job that is more of your average working class or lower class type of job, which means the people you're associating with during your entire lifetime are largely lower class or poverty-stricken people. Whereas a person from the upper class is going to go to high-level prep schools, things like this. When they go to college, they might attend an Ivy League school or a Stanford, some school of very high esteem, and then get high-paying jobs, meaning that the people that they are involved with most of the time are going to, again, be higher class people, upper class people. So it's more of an association thing for the reason that endogamy is most common. Now, the focus in a class system is on the means of production. From a sociological point of view, we want to know who owns the means of production. And this is looking at it from a conflict theorist perspective. You want to know who owns the means of production. And so a conflict theorist is going to say that there is a battle between two groups. Those two groups are the owners and the workers. And the conflict theorists we talked about already, their concepts are based on largely on the ideas of Karl Marx. He's going to have a couple terms he uses here. The owners, who he refers to as the bourgeoisie, and the workers, who are the proletariat. All right, and the idea here is that the bourgeoisie are going to, being the ones in power, they're going to do what they have to maintain that power. If you recall, the central concept of the conflict theorist is that everything comes down to power. And so they're going to view this as an issue of owners trying to maintain power over the proletariat, over the workers. Now, in a class system, we also, because there is the ability to move up and down, and because it is something of a discussion in our societies, we talk about social class. We try and figure out how people get grouped. And what we typically do in our society to determine social class is we look at how people are grouped based on levels of wealth, power, and prestige, which we will talk about in just a moment here. Now, these three aspects of determining social wealth, just to hit on them quickly. Wealth. The basic concept of wealth is that we are looking not just at your bank account or how much money you have in your wallet or how much is on your PayPal accounts. You know, these financial means of looking and seeing someone's resources. We're also looking at your assets. That means we're looking at your home, your car, clothing, access to video games, computers, television, technology like that. If you have hobbies that you're spending your money on, those would be included in assets. It could range anything from baseball cards to collectible guitars, whatever it might be. When we talk wealth, we're looking at the grand total of money and assets that somebody has. All right. The second aspect that we look at to determine social class is going to be power. The basic concept of power is, from a purely sociological definition, power is the ability to control the behavior of other people. And so what we look at here is, for power in terms of social class, do you have a position in society where you control other people, other people's behaviors? And what we mean by that, it doesn't mean you're some sort of Hitler-esque control freak. But what we're talking about much more so here is we're looking at somebody and saying, all right, what does your job entail? How does your job impact society? How does your job impact impact not just the society, but how people behave within a society? Do you have control even at your job? Are you in control of people? Are you in charge of people? Are you given responsibility over people? Are you a leader or are you a worker, essentially? And so power is taking into account those aspects. Someone who has great influence in society is going to have a great amount of power. They're going to have a great amount of control over at least a certain aspect of society. Even from a teaching standpoint, teachers, you would argue, have a level of power because they have controls over the outcomes, over the lives in many ways. They have these controls over their students. And that has the potential to have a huge impact on society. The third aspect for determining social class is prestige. The basic concept of prestige is respect. Does society respect what you do? And when we look at this, there are a lot of ways to determine whether a society gives you respect for what you do. Are you acknowledged as someone who is a contributor to society? Are you somebody who is seen as having any kind of influence on decision making within society? One of the key elements to prestige, sadly enough, also involves wealth. Or maybe not wealth, but the income, how much you are paid for your work. When you look at the lists, and this is something we'll talk about in class, you look at a list of what jobs are considered most prestigious. And it's not straight through the board this way, but for the most part, the high-paying jobs are the prestigious jobs, the low-paying jobs are the low-prestige jobs. Towards the top of the list are professions like doctor, lawyer, college professor, all fairly well-paying, fairly well-compensated jobs. Down towards the bottom is where you find like shoe shiners. And those low prestige jobs typically are not compensated very high. Now, functionalists, when we look at explaining stratification, we're going to look at both groups, the functionalists and the conflict theorists, and attempt to understand how they explain stratification. A functionalist is going to say stratification is necessary. The basic concept here is that the world needs ditch diggers. You have to have people who take on every job in society. Not everyone wants to work these hard manual labor jobs, but based on desire, based on effort, based on skill set, there's going to be people who have to work these jobs. And these people are going to be compensated appropriately for their previous effort, for their collegiate effort, for their high school effort, for their effort in trying to find decent jobs in the workplace, for that matter. If you have a higher paying job, a functionalist is going to tell you, you have that higher paying job because of your effort. You are somebody who has put in the requisite time at the high school level, at the college level, even post-grad in college. You are somebody who has also put in a lot of work, maybe even climbing the ladder within an organization to reach a point of being a high position, a person in a high position of authority where you're compensated good. So basically, functionalists, just to summarize, say stratification is necessary because we have to have people to work every level of the every level of, or every type of job in our society, and that your compensation is going to be appropriate based on how hard you've worked to achieve certain levels. The conflict theorist talks about stratification as something that has come from class exploitation. Basically, you guys know this because we've talked about it many times in class, but conflict theories or theorists, everything comes down to the concept of power. Who has the ability to control people? And a conflict theorist is going to point out that owners and groups, certain lobbying groups, political groups, have the power. And a conflict theorist is going to suggest that they will exploit, take advantage. When we talk exploit, taking advantage of the workers, we're talking about minimizing pay, minimizing worker rights, benefits being limited, worker safety being limited, regulations that the companies have to fail being limited. They're going to exploit and take advantage as much as they can to maximize their profit and maintain their control over the working class, over the proletariat class. So a conflict theorist, very negative outlook towards the owners of society and a very sympathetic outlook towards the workers of society. Now, final thing here, and this is how do we evaluate these two theories? Because looking at each, the functionalist and conflict theory, and looking at how they explain stratification, we can say that both of them have some very valid points. Functionalists, you cannot argue that functionalists are correct when they say that there are people needed for every type of job. If there was no one doing the low-level types of work, the hard manual labor, our society would come to a screeching halt. Functionalists are correct about that, but they ignore any exploitation that goes on, and we have to acknowledge that there is exploitation that goes on. They ignore that people have a lack of access to equal resources. The truth is, as we mentioned earlier when we were talking about the schools, there are kids who have great advantages in their elementary, middle, and high school levels and college levels. There are people who have huge disadvantages, and then there are people who have the average experience in those situations for an American. That is a lack of access to equal resources. Not everyone is getting the same education. Not everyone is having the same opportunities growing up. Not everyone comes from the same family life, as another example. So functionalists typically ignore that aspect as well. The other problem functionalists face with their explanation of stratification is that they have a tough time explaining the high rewards for relatively trivial work. Why Alex Rodriguez gets paid $250 million to hit 25 home runs and bat .290. This kind of, in our society, sports, the members of sports teams, athletes, are very, very highly paid for work that serves no function in our society besides distracting the masses from their problems. Now, a functionalist could hypothetically argue that that might be actually why they have the high pay that they do. Maybe their function in society, the athlete's function in society, is much greater than what we realize. If we talk back to the Roman era, the concept of bread and circuses, where people fought in the Colosseum as a means of entertaining and distracting the people from their everyday problems, maybe that's why in our society these athletes are so highly paid, is because we do actually value their work much more so than what we realize, because their work is not just that of putting a basketball through a hoop or catching a touchdown. Their work is much more so the idea of distracting us from our everyday problems. It's escapism. So you could hypothetically have that argument from the functionalists as well. The conflict theorists' biggest problem is that they ignore the fact that the unequal rewards that people get are not always based on exploitation or a lack of access to equal resources. A lot of it has to do with basic skill and effort. People are not going to be employed as a lawyer if they do not have the skill to argue a case, if they do not have the education necessary to be a lawyer. So that lack of skill and effort prohibits a lot of people from achieving that high-paying profession. And so conflict theorists, while they hit on some accurate points, they also ignore the fact that most of society, the jobs that they have, for the most part, are based on their skill level and the effort that they put in at the college, high school levels, and the levels or the work and effort they put in climbing the corporate ladder or the occupational ladder of some sort. All right. What I want you to be thinking about for tomorrow, for when we follow up with a discussion on this and an activity, I want you to be thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of the caste and the open class systems. All right. And I also would like you to be considering, when we talk prestige, the three aspects of that help us define your social class: prestige, wealth, power. Prestige specifically, what is prestigious to you? What makes something prestigious? What makes something makes an occupation have high prestigious rank to you? Be prepared to make some judgment calls and make some assessments of different professions that we might look at in class here. Also, finally, be prepared to discuss the functionalist and conflict theorist points of view on stratification and see if we have any questions or concerns about either one, weaknesses, strengths of either of their points of view. Thank you.